Archaeo-Hacks from Archaeo-Death. Professor Howard Williams explores shortcuts to a successful archaeology degree.
Greetings Archaeo-Deathlings, and welcome to this 5th Archaeo-Hack video, giving you a little insight into how to go about some Archaeo-Death activities and practices. In previous videos I've addressed aspects of how to do best as a student, how to do conferences and publications. This time I'm looking at perhaps the most accessible aspect of practical recording of aspects of human mortality from an archaeological perspective: memorial recording. So surveying cemeteries and churchyards is a really exciting and positive way to get involved in practical archaeology, and allows you to deal with mortuary archaeology without digging and disturbing the dead themselves. Cemeteries and churchyards populate our landscape. They're everywhere. Every settlement, every village, every town, every city may have one or more burial ground associated with a chapel, or you may have a separate burial plot. You will also have municipal cemeteries that emerged in the middle of the 19th century and came initially as private enterprises, but came to be organised and managed by local authorities as places for the disposal of the dead. And from the end of the 19th century through the 20th century, these often had crematoria added to them, or new cemeteries and burial grounds associated with fresh crematoria were established on the outskirts of towns and cities. And all of these, with adequate permission, are potential places where we can record the lives of past people and expressions and engagements with mortality. And the point to start off with is these are really rich and exciting stories that show us past craftspeople, the subject matter of the lives being mourned and commemorated, and the lives of the people doing the commemorating, who are behind the scenes commissioning, paying for, investing and visiting these memorials. So we learn about that complex relationship between the living and the dead. And this is as much mortuary archaeology, or the archaeology of death, as the investigation of ancient prehistoric cemeteries and burial grounds, tombs and so on, which is often perhaps what one imagines when one thinks about the archaeology of death. But the archaeology of death is the story of human relationships with mortality since the very earliest times, since the Paleolithic, since the Old Stone Age, right up to our time. And it's important to remember these are very fragile resources. They are not going to be here forever. These memorials have a lifespan. They are slowly dying themselves, slowly breaking apart through the effects of the weather, and sometimes by casual and carelessness, and sometimes actively targeted for vandalism. So they're not going to be here forever, and the stories they record and the relationships between the living and the dead they represent are on an ongoing process of breaking apart. So here's a gravestone where you can see that the weather has worn away the letters. And indeed they're damaged not only through weathering but through actual fragmentation. So here's a sandstone gravestone that sees the fracture marks running through it through seasonal warming and ice damage, the breaking apart of the rock itself. So these are not going to be here forever, and that's important to remember. These are a fragile resource, and they're not just because they're often made of stone doesn't mean they're enduring forever. Let's go through quickly why we would do this memorial recording. Well, I've already assured you it's as much a legitimate part of any kind of archaeological investigation of the human past and human relationships with the dead as any other. But there are some specific things. These are cemeteries and churchyards are key elements of our historic environment. Many are listed and protected, but many are not, and individual memorials often aren't. They're documents of past lives and the communities those lives represent. Communities that may be still alive and here, but very different from what once they were. Or communities that may have moved on. They may be now in very abandoned locations. Now, people are interested in these memorials through ancestry research, and also they are interested in these because of perhaps a particular historical interest, say in the military, or in scientists, or in women's history, or in the lives of of children. You know, there's lots of different types of subsets of history that we can access through cemeteries, including research into our own ancestry. But it's also important to say that the histories of a local cemetery or churchyard are not simply histories of that community. They tell us broader story about these islands in global connections, the travel of the people, the connections of people to those broader events, including wars and catastrophes that are happening on a global scale. So every community's cemetery and churchyard isn't simply a story about that local area, but about the broader narratives that mesh our history together, our shared human past. So even if you're a newcomer to a particular area, a local cemetery isn't just about the people buried there and memorialised there, it's your story too. And these are material cultures at the end of the day. These are physical traces of our modern world of the last 500 years, of our changing relationship with our environment, our transformation to create specialist environments for our living and for our dead. So these are material cultures of our world, and they deserve our investigation. But these aren't simply rich archives or libraries of human stories of lives once lived. They are a record of lives once dead, of people's relationship to mortality, and not just simply our relationship with mortality, but those past people's relationship with their loved ones. So it's the story of death, burial, bereavement, commemoration. And these often remain living spaces for communities. They are refuges for wildlife. So there's a nature conservation element to churchyards and cemeteries. Often many of them are managed in a light way or a careful way to foster biodiversity. They're places of recreation and visiting for many local people, walking the dog or just going for a picnic. As well as many times they are ongoing places of mourning and remembrance. New graves are added, or cremated dead are installed or interred and memorialised or scattered, or indeed people are doing the research, the ancestry research, and finding their relatives who they didn't know. They never knew, but they are a great uncle or something like that. They're finding their gravestones. So even if we're dealing with old graves or recent graves, these spaces are not just fossils of a past era. They are ongoing living spaces which people want to engage with. So while there are lots of popular sort of misconceptions of cemeteries as spooky or spaces, and often that gets cashed in on, but by people wanting to do ghost tours and so on, these are not places of just dead people and perhaps imagined spiritual forces. They are historic records of our communities and our human story that we all share. And that's why we should get involved and record those traces for posterity before they vanish. And there are many individual stories we can learn from gravestones. We can learn about the production, transportation, consumption, and the qualities of the stone selected. It should say that while gravestones are often made of stone, historically a range of other materials, including ceramics and iron, have been used as elements or indeed for the whole monument. We can learn about the date of memorials and how they change in style and form over time. We can see the selection of material used, often down to cost and what was locally available. We can see the Industrial Revolution happening through cemeteries, through the access of more exotic materials. And now we have global trade in memorial stones and marbles coming from all over the world to populate our cemeteries. But we can see the origins of that in the 19th century, where local slate or sandstone or limestone or granite or whatever it may be gives way to better quality materials that can be imported first by canal and then by train. We can see localized craft technologies where originally memorials were being made by someone who wasn't a professional. It had a local interest, a local craftsman, maybe a woodworker, carpenter, who did a bit of gravestone work on the side in the 16th, 17th centuries, through to the more professionalization of gravestones in the late 18th and 19th century. First for the aristocrats and the gentry from the 17th, 18th century, but then increasingly for the middle classes and then the working classes through the 19th and into the 20th century. So we can see changes in craft technology right up to now, and use of digital laser designing of inscriptions and photographs being sort of inscribed onto gravestones. We see shifts in form and style, reflecting the changing fashions, but also changing ideas about life and death. We can see patterns of consumption, that gravestones are a part of people's claims to status and position and wealth. So people wanted to consume gravestones. There were catalogues of gravestones you could select, and this was an industry by the 19th century. This is part of our global consumerist culture. We can also reveal a lot about religion, ethnicity, and bereaving practices. And for example, we can see in different choices of grave form. These are some traveller graves from Cambridge from the 1970s, just to give you an example. We can see religious affiliation often expressed, even if they are motifs and forms shared across different religious denominations. You can see the preference for particular kinds played out. Religious metaphors are commonplace. Sometimes their particular religious groups have specific burial plots, specific spatial relationships. You can see the language and allusions used in the form, symbols, texts. You can see the choices of religious ideas, even from the names of the individuals. The choice of personal name can tell you something about the ethnicity and origins of the person more than anything else on a gravestone. And attitudes to mortality, salvation, and memory can be sort of teased out by looking at these memorials. There's a lot we can say about what people think, what people felt, who they were, where they came from, how they defined themselves and their loved ones in death. We can also learn a lot about social identities and demographies from cemetery surveys and churchyard surveys. We can obviously see often recorded the age of the dead person, their perceived gender, their occupation, their family name and their family affinity, and many of these memorials record the names of multiple family members. We see their aspirations to social status. Sometimes they'll talk about their place of origin or place of birth, as well as their place of death. The biography of deceased individuals may be, although not in great detail on a public open air gravestone, as opposed to aristocratic or gentry tombs of earlier centuries. We do see biographical details, something of their profession. Sometimes they'll mention the circumstances of death. And we can also reveal contextual data about the broader cemetery space, the location of the cemetery and graveyard. The only thing the memorial itself is not the only thing to record. There's lots of information we can gain about buildings, gates and paths. Even the vegetation of cemeteries and churchyards is often carefully selected with memorial dimensions in mind. The choice of trees, the choice of bushes and grass, and how we can see the changing management of those spaces. So memorial recording in churchyard and cemetery survey is not simply about the memorials. We can see plots and divisions, the spatial arrangement, individual plots, and memorial relationships. These burials are often going up to separate people who are buying or plots. But sometimes you can see the careful choice to acquire plots next to each other for successive family members. But how do you go about doing it? It looks incredibly complex, and every gravestone is incredibly different from each other. Well, it does seem intimidating, and it must be said, like all archaeological recording, whether you are digging or not doing non-intrusive survey, there are standards and procedures to follow. You can't just rock up, take a few photographs and expect to have a systematic record of that site. And that's the problem with a lot of perhaps more amateur attempts, is that the study, they'll only focus on particular graves, or maybe they'll only look at things that interest them rather than doing a systematic recording of the entire cemetery. But the thing is that it's important to say that this is reasonably easy to do with a visual record and digital photography. Now, lighting conditions can make it challenging if it's rainy, or indeed directed light can make it difficult at times. Also, vegetation and damage. Not all memorials are as well preserved as this one, but with a mixture of digital photography, maybe taking a torch to shine oblique light across the surface to pick out features, and a visual record, most surveys can draw together, collect together some rich information. And of course, we have to record the condition of the gravestone itself, measurements and orientations, the materials selected, um, information about the type and form, the monuments, headstones, additional elements such as curbs, inscriptions, not only the language chosen, but which can be revealing, the lettering, the placement and arrangement, the choice to present biblical or other quotations can reveal important information. So it's not just simply the fact that there's a memorial, but it's the choice of shape, the choice of ornament and decoration, classical, Gothic, other forms including Neo-Egyptian, the location and arrangement of the memorial forms, the symbolic themes of remembrance and identity can be revealed through the decorative motifs selected. There's so much information packed onto these memorials, particularly from the late 18th and 19th through to the 20th and early 21st centuries. Let me finish off by saying a few things about best practice. Of course, you need to select and assess access and the quality and character of the churchyard or cemetery you're going to investigate. It's always good to make sure that it hasn't already been done, because many churchyards and cemeteries have had various attempts at recording them. To gain permission from relevant authorities, be it local authorities or church authorities, to do a survey is always essential, so that people know why you're there and what you're doing. Even if it's simply an email to the vicar or church warden, or to the local cemetery authority, there's a section of the local council or county council, they're more than happy usually for you to do the recording. Equipment, well, pen, paper, digital camera, or digital phone with a digital camera capability are always essential, as well as perhaps tape measures to do the primary recording. Ranging rods are always useful, but it's important to bring with you a full complement of items that you might need. Of course, also clothing like waterproofs, warm clothing. If you're standing still and doing recording in any kind of warm weather, it can still get very chilly. So it's important to make sure you've got hats and sun cream and all those other paraphernalia to make sure you're outdoors for a long period of time, that you're comfortable and safe. Maybe even a little chair that you can put down to do the recording, a little sort of fold-up chair if that's what you so need. So there's lots of sort of equipment things to think through. And then think of personnel. Are you doing this alone? Well, it's probably better to do it with at least one other person per gravestone, or pairs of people. It makes it much easier, much more fun, and much more social. All archaeological work is teamwork of different kinds, and pairs of individuals doing recording makes it far easier for one person to do the recording, the other person to do the actual interaction and observation, and the observer and the recorder sort of swap over. Public engagement. Remember, you're going to be in a public place, so think about that in terms of an opportunity that while you're there, you can tell people about what you're doing and why it's important, and you can spread the word and the importance of what you're doing. It's important to show care and respect. Care and respect to the fact that you're over the dead often. You're near the dead, but you're also associating with memorials that are part of their material culture of mourning and remembrance. And so it's important to show care and respect as you would to other material cultures and human remains themselves. And that also extends to living people who may be the descendants of those interred here, even if not that particular memorial, visiting the space while you're there. So while you may there's no reason to pretend you're an undertakers, and I've seen people get very upset with me for simply being there in a cemetery or churchyard doing recording, and there's no reason to apologise if you have permission and you're doing legitimate work for being there, and you don't have to dress in black and look like you're at a funeral. These are living spaces and they should be open to everyone. So talking, laughing, joking should be fine. But equally, you've got to be aware that people need to know that you're not doing anything that might damage or disrespect the dead. And I think that's important to show care and respect to the dead and to the living. To not disturb. You're not excavating. So no trowels, please. No moss removal. No ivy removal. You're not going to, because even those are damaging the memorial long term. Unless you're there to do a professional conservation job, you're just there to observe what you can see with your eyes. And you can see one of my students there peeking between the ivy, and this is fine, but we're not ripping it off, because that could actually compromise the integrity of the monument, and it could cause damage that could hurt you. So do not disturb as a rule. Do not disturb the ground, do not disturb the memorial. And therefore, this leads to a final point about health and safety. Health and safety. You have to look after yourself. No running. No, be careful. These memorials are fragile. You can see one here where the top has been seen as dangerous and fragmented and fell off, or was removed and placed with respect by cemetery authorities. These memorials shouldn't be leaned on. They do fall. So it's always be careful of beware of yourself when you're moving around the cemetery. Very uneven surfaces, particularly in wet weather, particularly in cold weather. But also be careful, the memorials may actually harm you. So health and safety is essential. So while I haven't been able to, in this short video, give you a full introduction to all of the information and ways of going about a graveyard survey, and I'll put some links in the description below so that you can follow up and learn more. There's a downloadable guide from the CBA, authored by Professor Harold Migham. There's a Scottish Archaeological Reform graveyard survey form, and there's various other online resources, including John Tierney did a wonderful video for the DigiDeath conference I organised this year with my students at the University of Chester. So he's done a lot of graveyard survey in Ireland, and he does a fantastic video. So I'll put all those links below. But remember, this is a story that never ends, and the story of our human past is we learn through the dead and their memorials, and the story of the human relationship with mortality. We continue to have insights through this investigation of past memorials. They may look familiar. You may presume that people have already explored these memorials, but actually often it's not the case, that they've got no proper formal recording. And these are often spaces that are not simply about the past but our future, our death and our mortality. And here a photograph of Overley Cemetery in Chester with the fragment of a 19th century memorial in the neoclassical style, and then modern cremation memorials that have been placed in a beautiful arrangement over what had been a lake within the Victorian garden cemetery, just to make the point that this is about the ongoing story of our relationship with our loved ones. Go Archaeo-Hack and do some surveys of graveyards and cemeteries. Thank you very much.
Sadly, we're all going to die. But while you're waiting, why not follow Archaeo-Death? Subscribe now on YouTube.